In August 1997, a retired police officer's body is found in his garage. A rifle rests against his legs.
Finding the body of a former colleague has stayed with me for years. It's hard to forget a sight like that.
Immediately, the investigators determined that Christian Jambert took his own life.
There was no investigation in the literal sense. Straight away, it was deemed a suicide. It was over. 3 or 4 interviews were carried out as the bare minimum.
Christian Jambert dedicated half his life to investigating the serial killer Émile Louis. Why would he kill himself just as the case was about to hit a breakthrough?
It doesn't make any sense to me. No, he was killed.
7 years after his death, an autopsy is carried out and the medical examiner concludes the death was criminal.
Here was a man who had been buried, a suicide victim whose death was never investigated, and it turns out he was murdered.
The plaintiffs criticize the justice system's slowness to act.
There are bound to be people from the police force who know something and are scared.
A second forensic examination is ordered.
This battle of experts muddied the water and drew out the case without focusing on what was important, searching for the killer.
To this day, Officer Jambert's death remains a complete mystery. We're in Auxerre in Burgundy, in the Yonne department. This was where Christian Jambert, a police officer renowned for his investigations into the serial killer Émile Louis, was found dead in the garage of his home. The initial investigation concluded that it was suicide, but the autopsy on the victim's body revealed that the death involved foul play. A murder investigation was then opened, almost 7 years after the incident. The investigation, full of twists and turns, gave rise to an unprecedented battle between experts, but never managed to establish for certain what led to the tragedy. We're looking back at a case that remains unsolved to this day. Auxerre, August 4th, 1997, at 9 a.m. Philippe Jambert arrives at the home of his father, Christian, a retired police officer. Didier Sebon Esquire, his attorney, describes that Monday morning.
He finds the door open. So Christian Jambert's son enters the house. He finds a note on the kitchen table.
Philippe Jambert reads the note written in red ink. It's a goodbye letter addressed to his sister, Isabelle. It's a somewhat cryptic message. For the life insurance, this is suicide, but I'm ill, so it should be okay. Sorry, darling Isabelle. Dad.
Straight away, he thinks, something serious has happened. He doesn't dare look for his father's body. He's scared of finding something beyond repair.
Immediately, Philippe Jambert phones his sister to tell her that he fears their father may have committed suicide.
And Isabelle runs to the police station. She's panicking. She wants to get help straight away. She thinks, maybe if they get there quickly, they'll be able to save my dad if something has happened.
It's Dominique Bornel, a police officer from the force in Auxerre, now retired, who's on duty that day.
I was on duty the night before, so I got to the station in Auxerre at 10 a.m. And soon after, Mr. Jambert's daughter came to the station, saying she couldn't get a hold of her father. So she wanted us to go with her to see what was happening at the house.
Officer Bornel immediately heads to Christian Jambert's house, along with his chief and an auxiliary police officer.
We started going into every room to see if we could find anything, or Mr. Jambert himself.
For as long as we didn't come across a dead or dying person, we thought maybe we could save him. Maybe he hadn't gone through with it. So Christian Jambert's children, while fearing the worst, couldn't fully imagine it.
The house is in order. There are no signs of a break-in. In the kitchen, the officers read the suicide note, but Christian Jambert is nowhere to be found. The search continues. That's when Dominique Bornel makes a worrying discovery.
I entered the bedroom. The bed was unmade, and there was an empty rifle case on top of it. Now I thought we were most probably going to find Mr. Jambert with the rifle next to him, and it was likely he had used it.
After inspecting all the rooms in the house, Officer Bornell goes down to the garage.
I find Mr. Jambert lying on the floor with a rifle resting against him.
Christian Jambert is dead. The former police officer from the Auxerre Research and Investigation Brigade was 56 years old.
Finding the body of a former colleague has stayed with me for years. It's hard to forget a sight like that.
But his children don't want to see his body. The police are the ones who end up telling them that their father is dead.
An investigation is opened to determine Christian Jambert's cause of death. The Auxerre Research and Investigation Brigade is charged by the district attorney with leading the investigation. Initial inspections of the victim's body continue. At the same time, the police start taking statements.
When we discovered Mr. Jambert's body, he was on his back, wearing pajamas, and one slipper on his left foot. The right slipper was about 8 inches away from the body. There was a pool of blood around his head. So we made our initial observations, took photographs, determined the body's position in the room and the rifle's position, and noted down descriptions of the body and the surroundings.
The weapon, which is resting on the victim's right leg, draws the investigators' attention. Corinne Herman Esquire is Christian Jambert's children's attorney.
The rifle, which the officers report finding on his right leg, has the breech backwards, in a single-shot position.
Blood is visible on the tip of the barrel.
They pick up the weapon and secure it by removing the magazine, in which they find 6 bullets remaining.
Samples are taken.
They swab the victim's hands.
We used Q-tips to swab his hands and arms, where gunpowder could have been deposited.
The police also scrape Christian Jambert's fingernails and put the samples into evidence bags. The city's medical examiner is called, but he's on vacation today, August 4th, 1997. So an emergency physician is rushed to the scene to carry out an initial inspection of the body. He notices a wound above the lip to the left. There's also a scalp injury on the left temple. Michel Sapanet is a medical examiner at the General Hospital in Poitiers. He will explain how the physician then tried to figure out the bullet's trajectory.
The physician used a slightly unusual technique. He inserted a rod into the left upper lip and made it come out from the hole in the left of the skull. This took some effort because the lip was slightly raised, so he had some difficulty following the route between what he deemed the entrance wound and the exit wound.
After inserting the rod into the skull, the doctor concludes that the bullet went through Christian Jambert's head from the lip to the left temple. But no bullet is found in the garage. Only cartridge cases are found on the ground.
3 cartridge cases were found at the scene, one 11 inches from the right foot, another a little further away from the left foot, and another one even further away.
3 cases and only 1 shot. For the police, this discrepancy is easily explained by the target on the wall at the back of the room.
So it seems Christian Jambert had a kind of shooting range in his garage where he regularly practiced. There was a target.
With the discovery of the 3 cartridge cases, we can assume that 2 of them could have been used when practicing on the target we found.
The rifle and the 3 cartridge cases are placed in evidence bags. At this moment, for the police as well as the physician, there is no doubt that Christian Jambert died by suicide.
There was nothing to suggest a homicide had taken place in the garage. Nothing was out of place. There was no sign of a struggle. The preliminary finding was suicide. Everyone agreed on this.
There's been a shot. The bullet hasn't been found, but it's not a big deal. That's how they leave things.
Christian Jambert's body is then transported to the Auxerre General Hospital so that the emergency physician can conduct a more thorough examination.
The body is completely undressed for this examination. The limbs and torso are inspected. It's not only the head that's examined.
No sign of struggle is found. The doctor then tries to determine the time of death.
The physician judges that the death occurred on the evening before the body was discovered, given the rigor mortis, hypostasis, and so on.
No x-rays of the body are taken to search for a possible bullet. The doctor examines the victim's head again.
As for the head injuries, there's the lip wound and the skull wound. But there's also a wound at the top of the back of the skull with contoured edges. It's flattened by about an inch, which often corresponds either to a direct impact, such as when someone is knocked unconscious, or to impact with the environment during a fall.
The emergency doctor rules that it was a fall. Christian Jambert could have received the head injury while falling to the floor after shooting himself in the face. The physician concludes that the victim committed suicide. A full autopsy of the body is not requested.
The burial permit is issued quickly, right after the examination at the hospital. So from the moment the doctor deems there's nothing out of the ordinary, he issues the burial permit. Things are going at full speed.
But the police continue their investigation by interviewing Christian Jambert's family and friends. First, they want to establish whether the rifle found on the body belonged to him.
Many of his loved ones know about this weapon. They recognize it when they're shown the weapon or photos of it. In particular, one person close to Jambert had been entrusted with his weapon for a while. He knows it well because he had kept it at his home. He tells us that a few days before the incident, Jambert asked him to give it back.
While interviewing the victim's children, the police learned that on May 16, 1995, 2 years earlier, Christian Jambert had tried to take his own life by ingesting a large quantity of pills and alcohol. At the time, he was going through a painful breakup. The investigators are convinced that in writing "I'm ill" in his suicide note, Christian Jambert was referring to his mental distress.
In the end, he was still depressed at the time. He still had problems in his life. He left a note on the kitchen table. It was a suicide note. The rifle cover was on the victim's bed, and he was found downstairs in a pool of his own blood. So for them, things were cut and dry. There was no investigation in the literal sense. Straight away, it was deemed a suicide and it was over. 3 or 4 interviews were carried out as the bare minimum. These case files aren't even 10 pages long.
The case is closed without further action on August 27, 1997, by the Auxerre District Attorney. Hubert Besson, a former reporter for the local newspaper, L'Un Républicain, followed this case from the start.
Jambert's children were told their father had had an autopsy. And, well, maybe it wasn't necessary to lie to them about this. There wasn't really any point.
The children believe what they're told, and they believe what everyone's telling them. They're reassured. They're told, yes, your father committed suicide. These are colleagues. Some of them they've known since they were children. They grew up in these barracks. When they're told we did everything, we checked everything, there was an autopsy, they believe an autopsy was carried out. They believe the results of the autopsy, except there was no autopsy.
And then the case is closed. It's suicide. Christian Jambert is buried, and that's the end of it.
The investigation into Christian Jambert's death was closed without further action on August 27, 1997, only 23 days after his passing. Are you surprised, like the victim's children's attorney, how brief the investigation was?
As soon as the interviews and the findings convinced the magistrate and the investigators that this was suicide, it was only natural that the investigation should stop. We're in the context of what the Code of Criminal Procedure calls an inquest into the cause of death. The district attorney was the one handling the investigation, assisted by an investigating department, in this case, the Auxerre Research and the Investigation Brigade. Generally, these investigations don't run into particular difficulties and are therefore quite brief.
But how come there wasn't even an autopsy? I thought with violent deaths, autopsies were automatic.
Contrary to what you may think, and to what many people think, there's no legal obligation. It's on a case-by-case basis. It's when there's a doubt about the causes or circumstances of the death that the district attorney orders an autopsy.
As it happens, don't you think that at the start of this case, there were a few things that cast doubt on the circumstances around Christian Jambert's death?
Yes, of course there was mystery. The police didn't find the bullet that killed Christian Jambert in the garage. Remember, it supposedly went through his skull. However, they found 3 cartridge cases. I want to believe this story about the firing range, but it would have been better, I think, to carry out an autopsy, even a simple X-ray of the body, instead of taking this doctor's conclusions at face value. He wasn't a medical examiner, and he had neither the skills nor the training.
Speaking of which, Jean-Marc, what do you think of the method the emergency physician used to determine the bullet's trajectory?
I've been to many scenes where bodies have been found, probably several hundred, and I've never seen a doctor use this method. It is an exam that can be carried out, that's true. It's still used, but in an autopsy room and by a confirmed expert. You get the feeling that this emergency physician wanted at all costs to make the 2 holes he found coincide with the metal rod to make his report consistent.
In total, the inspection of the crime scene only lasted 45 minutes. But above all, it turned out that the samples taken from the garage weren't even analyzed. Does that surprise you?
45 minutes for the inspection is short, very short. And what I don't understand is why the samples were taken and not put to any use. Analysis of the swabs applied to the victim's hands could have proved for almost certain whether Christian Jambert had used the rifle on himself. When you discharge a firearm, expanding gases are released and land on the shooter's hands as gunpowder residue.
The investigation was entrusted to the Auxerre Research and Investigation Brigade. As it happens, Christian Jambert spent a great deal of his career with this brigade. Do you think it was wise for the victim's former colleagues to lead the investigation?
No. Again, I think that was a mistake. The risk is that his former colleagues won't be objective. They were bound to know that Christian Jambert had been through a serious depression and was still fragile. There are no secrets in the force, especially when you live in the same barracks, which is the case with the French gendarmerie. So the investigators from the Auxerre Brigade arrived with preconceptions which aren't desirable in an investigation.
Christian Jambert's death is announced in the press. Articles about his professional background paint a picture of an unrelenting and passionate detective who didn't hesitate to go beyond his professional duties to carry out investigations on his own. Christian Jambert was born on November 26, 1940 in Fourchambault-Nièvre. Raised by foster parents, he had a difficult childhood. At 25 years old, he decided to join the police force.
Jambert grew up in the foster care system. He was a self-made man. He worked his way up step by step and proved his worth, always fighting. He always believed in absolute justice and was ready to sacrifice anything to get to the bottom of his cases.
Passionate about crime, in 1976 he was appointed to the Auxerre Research and Investigation Brigade in Yonne. He started devoting most of his time to his job. Soon, his family life was suffering and he divorced his wife. Daniel Stalinovic, Auxerre's deputy prosecutor from 1981 to 1984, regularly worked alongside Christian Jambert. They became friends.
There was an instant connection because he was a go-getter. In the police, like in every institution, there are highly motivated people, while others just wait for retirement. He belonged to the first category without a doubt. He loved his job and he was very driven. He didn't work to make himself look good. Far from it. He worked to get results. Men like that are few and far between, so he stood out.
Christian Jambert soon became one of the most valuable members of the Auxerre Research and Investigation Brigade. Leaving no stone unturned, he solved most of his cases.
He was tenacious. He always reminded me of a terrier. Those dogs, when they've got something in their jaw, would rather be killed than let it go. That was very much his character.
He was nicknamed the Tomcat because he never let go. He was truly recognized by his colleagues. You can still hear echoes of this today. He was really a detective who cared about his cases and was prepared to put himself in danger.
Christian Jambert's professional veracity sometimes turned into obsession.
He was a police officer who worked day and night, in the evenings, at parties. He was a police officer who was out of the ordinary.
He knew to take his time, to go and come back to shady places, to spend time talking to this person or the other.
From the 80s onward, Christian Jambert became especially passionate about one case, the missing women of Yonne. He was the first person to make the connection between the disappearances of young women with intellectual disabilities and a bus driver, a certain Émile Louis.
Christian Jambert was the key figure in the missing women of Yonne case. He was the one to spot the connection between the different disappearances.
For nearly 20 years, the police officer didn't let up on the investigation. It was the case of his life. He felt he was the only person who was interested in these young women, all foster children like him.
For me, in the investigation into the Yonne disappearances, he was the first forensic investigator. I really admire the way he rebuilt the file and rethought the case. It was truly an unparalleled investigation.
A detective at heart, an out-of-the-ordinary police officer, his working methods and his single-handed investigations often irritated his superiors.
He was an uncontrollable lone wolf. That's what he was criticized for.
So much so, in fact, that his superiors sometimes asked him to account for his time and his activities, and he went to the district attorney's office asking for an order justifying how he spent his time. I'm not saying to cover his tracks, because everything he did was perfectly legal, but to justify his time.
The Gendarmerie police force, which is a branch of the military, prefers people who stand to attention and follow orders without batting an eyelid. And Jambert wasn't made that way. Without a doubt, that's why he was never promoted above warrant officer when, given his professional qualities, he could have aimed higher.
Dominique Laverrière, an independent legal commentator, thinks Officer Jambert gradually made himself vulnerable.
First, investigations always bother someone. Always. The truth can always bother someone. What's more, Jambert has a flaw, and it's that he's a nosy Parker, if you will. This is both useful and very dangerous. It's very dangerous because a nosy Parker can get caught in his own game. He's alone. He doesn't have a safeguard. There's no one he can pass the buck to or who will tell him, "Be careful, you're going too far." You're more in the realm of fantasy than fact. So he has no safeguards, and that's pretty dangerous.
In 1997, Officer Jambert was transferred to Nevers to work in the Criminal Intelligence Unit. For him, this new post was a punishment.
In Nevers, he's no longer a field investigator. His role is more or less administrative. Anyway, he's pushed into the background. You don't want an uncontrollable officer like him on the loose. So, if you confine him to a desk job, you're sure to have him under control.
This leads to severe depression. He was extremely sad because he was used to Yonne. He had his friends and his way of working there, and he knew the local area. And Nevers is far from home. It's different, and he doesn't feel good there.
On November 27, 1995, Christian Jambert retired and returned to live in Auxerre. He was still extremely determined to solve the Yonne missing women case. In May 1997, he was thrilled when a legal investigation was finally opened by the Auxerre Public Prosecutor's Office. At the start of the investigation, he got to know Corinne Herman, the attorney for one of the case's plaintiffs.
When we met, when the Missing Women of Jan report was filed, he was totally methodical. I saw a detective before me. I didn't see a retired police officer who was unwell or depressed. Above all, you got the sense that it gave him the energy and drive to join us on the Jan Missing Women case. It gave him a purpose. You could see that he wanted to be by our side, to help us with the process.
That's one of the reasons that makes us seriously doubt that Christian Jambert died by suicide. The investigation of his life, the one he talked about to everyone, was finally being reopened. Something didn't add up.
Morissette Bethry, the foster parent of one of the young women who went missing, met Christian Jambert shortly before his death.
Mr. Jambert was rather happy and planning a lot of things. He was retired. And as he said, now I can do and say whatever I want with no one to stop me. He made us see that now he was back. Things would move forward. He saw his life ahead of him.
For Morissette Bethry, it also seems highly unlikely that Christian Jambert would have decided to take his own life.
How could someone who told us everything was back on track, he was going to do what was required, the case was going to move forward, and we might finally find out what happened, let us down in one fell swoop and commit suicide? It doesn't make any sense to me. As far as I'm concerned, someone did it. I thought to myself, no, he was killed.
In the years after Christian Jambert's death, the investigation confirms the officer's suspicions about Émile Louis. In December 2000, the bus driver is arrested for kidnapping and false imprisonment. Informed of developments in the Jan Missing Women case, Isabelle, Christian Jambert's daughter, is also surprised that her father could have taken his life just as the justice system was finally taking interest in the case. She asked the Auxerre District Attorney's Office for a new inquest into the cause of death. On November 5, 2002, the District Attorney grants her request and opens a legal investigation. Inquiries are carried out, but no new information comes to light. On February 19, 2004, Isabelle Jambert, supported by her brother Philippe, calls for a forensic examination to be carried out after learning that, contrary to what she was told, there was never an autopsy of her father's body. The police officer's children accept the painful ordeal of an exhumation. Today, they prefer to remain silent and have their attorney represent them.
You have to understand that Christian Jambert's children were raised in barracks, in a gendarmerie environment. So asking for an investigation into their father's death meant going against the family they had grown up in.
Didier Seban Esquire was at the cemetery in Auxerre on March 31, 2004 for the exhumation of Christian Jambert's body.
An exhumation is a powerful act. It means disturbing a grave. You're there to dig a man out of the ground, to seek the truth in the depths of a coffin. For the family, it feels very heavy. They were asked for their permission, but most families are so keen to know the truth, they'll allow the dead to be disturbed.
Christian Jambert's body is taken to the prestigious Institute of Forensic Medicine in Paris, headed at the time by Professor Dominique Lecomte, a renowned medical examiner. For this out-of-the-ordinary autopsy, the medical examiner is assisted by Jean-Claude Schlinger, a firearms and ballistics specialist from the Court of Appeal of Paris.
Strangely, the body was in a pretty good state of preservation, considering it was underground for 7 years. The flesh had obviously rotted, but the body was still mostly intact, at least enough so that the necessary findings could be made.
The body is x-rayed.
In the head, several metal fragments were found.
X-rays also reveal a fracture of the left orbital arc, an injury that experts still can't explain. Assisted by Jean-Claude Schlinger, the medical examiner then begins the autopsy. They look first at the lip wound, which has been designated as the gunshot entrance wound since the case began.
The medical examiner removed the skin to reveal the bones. And that's when we noticed that under the wound on the lip, there was no hole. If a bullet enters at this level, it will pass through the bone. We didn't find any bullet holes in the bone.
This raises a question, because it's hard to imagine a bullet entering there without leaving a mark on the bone.
The medical examiner and the ballistics expert are positive that the lip wound wasn't caused by a gunshot. It doesn't have the characteristics of an entry wound. So where did this injury come from? 7 years after the death, it's difficult to precisely determine its origin.
It could have been caused by an impact with any object. It's possible that the end of the barrel was applied with force, causing the injury, but that's all. We can only speculate. There's nothing tangible to go on.
The experts then study the hole in the skull, described as the exit wound by the emergency physician from Auxerre. Again, their findings contradict the initial conclusions.
The way the bones are broken corresponds to an entrance wound, meaning penetration from the outside to the inside. What's more, there are dark marks around the hole, which are completely consistent with gunpowder residue.
The bullet therefore struck Christian Jambert in his left temple. This explains the fracture revealed by the X-ray.
The fracture of the orbital arc here completely matches the entrance wound on the temple. The shock wave from the barrel is what leads to fractures in the skull, especially this part of the orbital arc, which is relatively fragile.
The experts carry on with the examination. While opening the jaw, they make an unexpected discovery.
We found another hole at the back of the mouth, which was also a bullet entrance wound.
Two separate injuries, two entrance wounds. The expert's assessment is clear. Christian Jambert wasn't shot only once, but twice.
So there's a gunshot in the mouth from the bottom to the top, and another which took a practically perpendicular trajectory to the first, with an entrance wound on the left side of the head.
The team determined that each gunshot was immediately fatal on its own. In this case, naturally, the logical conclusion is that if he was immediately killed, or at least incapacitated by the first shot, how could there be a second?
This makes it very unlikely to have been suicide.
The medical examiner then goes about extracting the metal fragments revealed by the X-ray. According to the ballistics expert, they are shattered remains of two bullets. Jean-Claude Schlinger examines them to determine the caliber.
The bullets found inside the head are consistent with a .22 long rifle.
.22 long rifle is the caliber of the rifle found on Christian Jambert's body. But the ballistics expert will never be able to say for certain whether these bullets were fired from the police officer's rifle. There's no chance of comparison because all the sealed evidence has been destroyed.
We no longer have the weapon. That's quite significant. We no longer have the weapon, so we can no longer use this weapon to check if the bullets and shells that were found match the rifle.
At the end of their examination, the medical examiner and the ballistics expert conclude that the suicide theory is incompatible with their findings. According to them, Officer Christian Jambert was murdered.
It was a real bombshell. For the police, It's an emotional roller coaster. How could their colleagues have missed that? Here's a man who has been buried, a suicide victim whose death was never investigated or acted on, a police officer, an upholder of the law, and it turns out he was murdered and nothing was done about it.
It's emotional. It isn't easy to manage because we're starting from scratch. We have to move on to a different stage. Opening an investigation is the bare minimum in this context. We're going to be able to move forward with this man's death and finally keep our promises to him. Because we've met him, because we knew him, and because we owe him that.
The results of the autopsy carried out by Professor Dominique Lecomte, assisted by ballistics expert Jean-Claude Schlinger, come like a bolt from the blue in the investigation into Christian Jambert's death. On April 2, 2004, a homicide investigation is opened by the Auxerre District Attorney's Office. Nearly 7 years after the incident, the theory of suicide gives way to that of murder.
It's the perfect example of a case that got off to a bad start. We know that the preliminary investigations and the preliminary findings are essential. If you mess them up, everything gets very complicated and there's no going back. And here we have that exact situation. This is a textbook case.
We know that the physician who attended the discovery of Christian Jambert's body was not a specialist in forensic medicine, but it's still hard to understand how he failed to notice that the victim had been shot twice in the head.
The bullets are .22 long rifle caliber. A .22 long rifle bullet is like this. It's 0.2 inches in diameter, a fifth of an inch. It makes small holes that don't necessarily cause heavy bleeding, and which can sometimes be hard to see with the naked eye. That would explain why the emergency physician didn't see the entrance wound inside the victim's mouth, on the palate.
The specialists in Paris have established that the wound on the left temple was in fact a second entrance wound, meaning that 2 shots had been fired in keeping with the 2 perpendicular trajectories. But above all, they've determined that each one of these shots was immediately fatal.
We have already seen gunshot suicides with 2 bullets. In that case, an automatic weapon is used, and due to contradictions on the trigger, the person fires twice in a row and nearly always in the same place. According to Professor Lecomte's conclusions, it's impossible for Christian Jambert to have shot himself in the mouth and then the temple, or vice versa, since each shot was instantly fatal.
The Christian Jambert murder investigation is launched nearly 7 years after the police officer's death. But the problem is that the investigators can't rely on the material evidence taken from the scene where the body was found, since, unfortunately, all the sealed specimens have been destroyed.
It's a real shame, but it makes sense. In August 1997, the investigation ruled the death a suicide, and the case was closed with no further action. There was no longer an investigation to carry out, and no one to identify or search for. It was an open and shut case.
The police must now re-examine the scene where the body was found as a crime scene. We know that Christian Jambert was found in his garage with 2 bullets in his head, wearing pajamas, the rifle case was open on his bed, and the door to the house wasn't locked. Based on this information, can we come up with a scenario of the events?
Based on these factors, we can imagine that Christian Jambert is in bed when he hears a strange noise. He gets up, he picks up his rifle, he takes it out of the case, and he goes downstairs to see if someone has broken in. When he enters the garage, someone knocks him out, which causes the injury to the top of his skull. Then the assailant kills him. I could go on and come up with something wonderful for you, but that would be pure fiction, like a novel, and investigating isn't about fiction.
How do you think the police should go about trying to solve this case?
Their only choice is to question people again. They have to interview or re-interview the victim's family, friends, and neighbors. Of course, there's the added difficulty that time has passed. They will need to find these people and jog their memories.
The investigators try to establish if Christian Jambert had any enemies and what the motive for the murder could have been. So they decide to look into the victim's professional background to find out if one of his investigations could have put him in danger. For nearly 16 years, Officer Jambert followed the Yon missing women case. It all began close to Auxerre in Rouvray on July 5, 1981. Christian Jambert was leading the investigation into the murder of Sylvain Lesage, a 23-year-old woman with an intellectual disability who was in social care. The remains of her body were found near a river under a heap of manure. Jacques Pradel, a crime journalist, has a deep knowledge of Christian Jambert's investigations to try and solve the case.
He obviously took an interest in the woman's boyfriend. The boyfriend's name was Émile Louis. At the time, he was about 50 years old. He was a bus driver. He was a fisherman. He often came to that area on fishing trips.
The police officer soon became convinced of Émile Louis's guilt.
From that point on, Jambert continued his investigation and noticed that other young women in social care had disappeared. That's how he realized that every time someone went missing, Émile Louis wasn't far away.
So Jambert thought, I'm onto a serial killer.
Christian Jambert made a list of missing people in the region. He discovered that 6 young women, all with mild disabilities and all in social care, had gone missing in the late 70s. One of them, 22-year-old Madeleine Desjustes, vanished into thin air in July 1997. Every evening, she used to return to her foster family's home on the bus Émile Louis drove.
And then one evening, she didn't come home. We were worried. We went to the police and told them what was going on. At first, they didn't want to do anything. She was 22. She was free to do what she wanted. They kept saying, no, don't come back right away. Come back in 8 days. You might hear from her. 8 days, 15 days, a month passed with no news. Nothing.
The first person to take an interest in Morissette Bethry's story was Officer Christian Jambert. When they met for the first time, 4 years had gone by without Morissette receiving any news from Madeleine or from the police, to whom she had reported the disappearance.
He was the only one who took an interest. The only one who wanted to take on the case and try to prove that Émile Louis was the culprit. He told me, I have to find something.
Christian Jambert was certain that there was a link between these disappearances and the murder of Sylvain Lesage, whose body was found in Rouvray. He arrested Émile Louis in December 1981. The bus driver denied any involvement with Sylvain Lesage's murder, but he did admit to sexually molesting the children his partner fostered. For this, Émile Louis was sentenced to 5 years in prison. Due to sentence reductions, he was released in 1984 and went to live in the Var region. But Christian Jambert wasn't giving up on his investigation into the disappearances. He shared his findings with Daniel Stalinovic, who was at the time Auxerre's deputy public prosecutor. Convinced by his work, the prosecutor asked him to put together a report of the investigation. The police officer wrote it up. Everything was included. Christian Jambert cited facts, quoted witnesses, and named dates and places. He gave his report to Daniel Stalinovic on June 23, 1984, in hopes that an investigation would be opened.
I received the report. I sent it to the examining magistrate to get his opinion. He was already working on a case, the body in Rouvray. I asked him if the new investigation should be added to the case file on the body in Rouvray, or if we should get a new case file. That was my question. So that's what we agreed. My prosecutor told me, when I hear back from the examining magistrate, we'll deal with it accordingly.
But at that point, Daniel Stalinovic was transferred to Paris. He could no longer monitor the progress of Christian Jambert's report. Simultaneously, the examining magistrate in charge of Sylvain Lesage's murder dismissed the case.
Jambert gave him the report. He did his job, and he waited for the next step, but the next step never came.
Christian Jambert never received a response, but he carried on unofficially investigating. For him, this case became a complete obsession.
He would never give up. He would never let go of Émile Louis. Even after his report, he continued following him. There was no legal framework to do so. He did it outside of any legal framework.
From the sidelines, he carried on following Émile Louis, watching him and questioning the people around him. All things that no one had asked him to do.
Christian Jambert continued fighting to solve the case of the missing women in Yann, but he felt alone.
The legal system gave him the cold shoulder. He was spurred on by the idea of bringing down Émile Louis. But that didn't happen.
In 1987, the police officer was transferred to Nevers. After he left, his investigation was forgotten. The report Christian Jambert wrote in 1984 on the young women who went missing in Yann, implicating Émile Louis, did not lead, as the officer hoped, to a legal investigation being opened. The Auxerre district attorney judged that there wasn't enough evidence. In 1993, the Yann Disabled People's Association was created to put pressure on the legal system. It fought for the young women, who were still considered runaways, to have their disappearances investigated. Very soon, Christian Jambert got involved with this association. Despite the constant efforts of Pierre Monnoir, president of the Yann Disabled People's Association, the justice system did nothing.
There was a significant culture of silence in the department, which came from the social services, the justice system, and the departmental council. You shouldn't say anything, you shouldn't make any waves or tarnish their reputation. I've been accused of tarnishing the department on several occasions.
In 1996, Pierre Monnoir decided to appeal to the public by taking part in a TV show presented by Jacques Pradel called Perdu de Vue, which focused on finding missing people.
We have been contacted by a Disabled People's Association. This evening, the missing women's parents have joined us on set to say they want to get to the truth.
For Officer Jambert, this program was very important. It validated the years he had spent investigating.
Of course, we invited Officer Jambert to join us on set, to answer my questions, shed some light on the gray areas of the case, and tell his own story too. He didn't do it. He felt he had a duty of confidentiality, and his place wasn't on the set of a TV show. He eventually agreed to be filmed at his home. I can picture it. He was filmed on a couch near his TV. He didn't wear his police uniform.
Christian Jambert used his platform to publicly accuse Émile Louis.
All of a sudden, there's a whole string of suspicious disappearances of young women, particularly wards of the Department of Health and Social Security, and all these young women used to ride the bus he drove.
During his interview, the recently retired police officer also fiercely criticized the justice system's inertia.
I gave the file I put together on the preliminary investigation to the public prosecutor, like every police officer should. That's the norm. Then the public prosecutor is the one with the file. I asked for an official investigation to be carried out and for there to be a direct referral from the prosecutor. I asked for a follow-up, and to my great surprise, I never heard anything else about the file.
The program caused a scandal. A few months later, on May 30th, 1997, Pierre Monnoir's association, which had filed a civil case, finally managed to get an investigation opened. This was the start of the official inquiry into the missing women of Yann. Christian Jambert wanted his investigations to be taken into account.
At that time, that case was a big part of his life. Yes, he wanted to help us, using everything he'd done.
He was very happy. I think he was very happy indeed. Even if I was surprised, I can still see him wide-eyed saying, "You managed to get here. How did you do it when I struggled for so many years?" Yes, I think he felt vindicated.
2 months later, Christian Jambert was found dead in his garage. Everyone who knew him back then knew how keen he was for the Yann missing women case to be solved. When Morissette Bethry heard about his death, she immediately thought he had been murdered.
Émile Louis had Officer Jambert killed. I think Émile Louis could have killed him.
But Émile Louis, who lived in the south of France at the time, was soon let off the hook by the investigators.
Not only was it unlikely, but it was checked. Émile Louis's schedule was checked. It certainly wasn't in his interest to go back. So he'd been interviewed in the VAR and he was known to be ill at the time, so that lead was checked.
Émile Louis was a coward. I mean, he wasn't the kind of man to pick up a gun. He was the kind of man who killed a vulnerable young woman. But he wasn't the kind of man to go toe-to-toe with another man.
If it wasn't Émile Louis, could it have been someone who wanted to protect the bus driver? In other words, someone who wanted to stop Christian Jambert from testifying.
Jambert couldn't have been murdered because of Émile Louis. It doesn't make sense. It just doesn't make sense. Everyone agrees that Émile Louis is a common thug. He's a murderer and a maniac. Who's going to protect Émile Louis? Nobody. If anybody was to be bumped off, it was him, not Jambert.
In November 2004, Émile Louis is sentenced to life imprisonment by the Yonne Criminal Court for the kidnapping, false imprisonment, and murder of 7 young women. In June 2006, his sentence is upheld by the Paris Court of Appeals. Pierre Monnoir is still wondering why Christian Jambert's report, which contained incriminating evidence and could have led to catching the bus driver sooner, wasn't used.
It was in the safe in the prosecutor's office. It was a sensitive file, kept in the safe.
The case of the missing women of Yonne is one of the biggest miscarriages of justice in France. Reporter Hubert Besson recalls interviewing the district attorney in charge of the case file. The magistrate gave a very surprising explanation for the justice system's lack of interest.
He told me, "We didn't have time. You don't realize how much traffic litigation there can be in Yonne." In other words, there was so much speeding going on that there was no time to look into the murders and disappearances of young women. It's unbelievable. Even though we've had 7 murders, it's...
Jean-Marc, we're at the criminal court in Yonne. This is where, on November 25, 2004, Émile Louis was first sentenced to life imprisonment with a mandatory minimum of 18 years for the kidnapping, false imprisonment, and murder of 7 young women aged between 16 and 25, all wards of the Department of Health and Social Security. This sentence was handed down 20 years after Christian Jambert gave the investigation report to the deputy prosecutor in Auxerre. 20 years is a pretty long time.
There was indeed a serious malfunction in the criminal justice system. When Christian Jambert submitted his report, he was convinced that Émile Louis would soon be indicted. His report clearly demonstrates that the bus driver is the common link between all the missing women in Yonne and that he's at the center of the case. But unfortunately, the deputy public prosecutor, Daniel Stadinovic, who's convinced that Christian Jambert's accusations against Émile Louis are well-founded, leaves Auxerre.
But how come the other magistrates in Auxerre didn't take the reins?
It's sad to say, but they didn't buy it. They didn't buy this story about a serial killer. Remember, this was the early 80s. At that time, the French justice system and police didn't believe in serial killers. They thought it was something that only happened in the USA. This blindness on the part of the justice system and the police had severe consequences, as Émile Louis took advantage of his freedom to sexually assault little girls and to torture and rape his wife and stepdaughter.
But what's also hard to understand is why the police didn't support Christian Jambert or carry on with his investigation.
The problem was Christian Jambert was unusual. He was a lone ranger, a real free spirit who carried out investigations on his own initiative. His behavior concerned his superiors, who criticized him for turning his back on military discipline.
But does that mean that nobody in the Auxerre Research and Investigation Brigade was aware of his inquiry into Émile Louis?
No, Christian Jambert told his colleagues about the nature and progress of his investigation, but the information wasn't passed on to those in command. We've since learned that the colonel, the head of the Yonne force, who Christian Jambert reported to, had never heard about this case until it came to light in the press in 1997. It's important to note that at the time, the gendarmerie had little interest in court cases. Their main missions were public safety, law and order, and traffic policing. Court cases weren't yet part of their culture and were of little interest to the upper ranks. Since then, things have changed a lot.
In November 2004, during Émile Louis's trial, Christian Jambert's work was praised. This was a few months after the autopsy, which determined his death involved foul play. But in the meantime, a second opinion was ordered by the examining magistrate, leading to a new twist in the investigation into Christian Jambert's death. On April 23, 2004, 3 weeks after the first autopsy, the examining magistrate decides to refer to specialists at the Institute of Forensic Medicine in Lyon. He orders Christian Jambert's body to be transported there from the Institute of Forensic Medicine in Paris. François Perrain is a district attorney. From 2006 to 2011, he was based in Auxerre in charge of the investigation into Christian Jambert's death.
The murder theory had to be confirmed at all costs, which is why the examining magistrate, to make sure that there were no mistakes in the first autopsy, decided to order a second.
It's natural to get a second opinion in a case with extensive media coverage. In such a serious context, it's natural.
The medical examiners in Lyon confirm the victim was indeed shot twice. They agree with the first experts that a bullet was fired inside the mouth. However, they don't agree on the second shot in the left temple. Professor Patrice Mongon was one of the medical examiners responsible for this new autopsy.
No, we rejected this trajectory. The hole in the bone wasn't at all perpendicular, as described in the first report. This one looked like a keyhole, meaning that one end was rounded and the rest had a rectangular shape.
The shape of this hole leads the experts from Lyon to conclude that the injury was caused by a tangential shot.
A tangential shot is the opposite of a perpendicular shot. A perpendicular shot is like this. A tangential shot is when it occurs tangentially, so almost parallel to the surface of the skull.
The forensic experts determine a completely different trajectory for the bullet.
So in this trajectory, the bullet enters, penetrates under the lip here, passes under the skin, arrives at the orbital region, and then enters the head. Then it stops an inch or so deeper inside the head.
Jean-Luc Bosco, an expert in gunshot residue analysis, assisted with the second autopsy by examining the wound above Christian Jambert's lip. He determines that it is in fact a bullet entrance wound.
I highlighted a white mark. And when I carried out an X-ray and chemical analysis of this mark, I revealed the main element which makes up most bullets, lead. What's more, you can see this mark clearly in the photo. It's the mark of a shot. When the bullet entered the body at high speed, it left a film of lead that's still present 7 years later.
The medical examiners in Lyon have no doubts about this new trajectory. They report their findings, which contradict the first experts' findings.
So, according to the experts from the second institute, these two trajectories are in fact compatible with the suicide theory.
The first attempt failed. The shot was fired too far forward. A second shot immediately afterwards achieved the police officer's goal.
Christian Jambert allegedly fired the first shot in his lip before shooting himself for a second time in the mouth. But Jean-Claude Schlinger, the ballistics expert from the first autopsy, totally refutes this new report. For him, the injury on the lip can't be an entrance wound.
When you discharge a firearm, when you place the barrel, all the gases produced by the combustion of the gunpowder spread inside the body. This leads to what's called a lead chamber, meaning a characteristic detachment of the tissue. And there's no injury that fits with that.
There's another point of contention between the experts. The medical examiners from Lyon determined that only the second shot was fatal. The first shot would only have paralyzed the victim on one side of his body, Ms. Herman considers it highly unlikely that Christian Jambert would have found the strength to pull the trigger again.
We're being told that he did all of this while being virtually paraplegic. Since the first shot had caused notable damage, he could no longer use his right hand. He could no longer move the right side of his body. Well, mechanically speaking, it seems a bit far-fetched to us.
At the end of the second autopsy, a cast is made of Christian Jambert's skull, and the police officer is reburied. The examining magistrate then requests a third opinion. This takes place in Bordeaux on November 4, 2005. It's carried out using only photos of the body and the cast of the skull. The specialist from Bordeaux concludes that suicide is consistent with his findings. With the lawyer's support, Christian Jambert's children call for the different experts to get together and compare their opinions. To allow the panel of experts to work directly on Christian Jambert's body, a second exhumation is arranged. On December 5, 2007, the plaintiff's attorney, the examining magistrate, and the prosecutor in charge of the case go to the forensic center in Bordeaux to attend the experts' meeting.
The atmosphere is a bit tense, which is to be expected. At the end of the day, there's a corpse. There are experts going against each other. These forensic disagreements are always a bit difficult to cope with. It doesn't feel good to be doubted.
But when Christian Jambert's coffin is opened, the medical examiners notice that some bones have disappeared. And not just any bones, but ones that are essential for the assessment: the bottom jaw and part of the left eye socket.
It's another bolt from the blue. It's unbelievable that this has happened again in this case. So that's where they start from. They suspect that some bones have been lost, and it takes a good 2 hours for everything to be searched to check whether these bones are really missing or not. And they are missing.
The experts study the incomplete skull. A rod is inserted at lip level and pushed up towards the hole in the temple. This reveals the trajectory established by the medical examiners in Lyon. But for Jean-Claude Schlinger, the ballistic specialist from the first autopsy, this is no surprise. The rod passes through because the trajectory is made easier by the state of the skull.
The fact that the bottom jaw is missing makes it easier to reconstruct this trajectory from the hole above the upper lip, since the bottom jaw isn't in the way. So finding an angle that lines up with the hole in the temple is easy. If you put the jaw back in place, it would be much more difficult.
The discussions continue, but they soon become heated.
The meeting between the experts soured. We witnessed an epic scene where they took each other to task. Some saying they had only seen hunting accidents, others saying they didn't know where one of the skull bones was.
There's so much hostility between certain medical examiners and specialists. It's disconcerting with the body there and the family's legitimate demands for an explanation.
It's a tribal warfare. You might think that, out of respect for the dead, these medical examiners would take a purely scientific view of things. But unfortunately, there's conflict. In fact, I've heard, and every med student will tell you, that the Lyon Medical School has always hated the Paris Medical School.
The first experts, Professor Dominique Lecomte and Jean-Claude Schlinger, are sticking to their guns. For them, this is definitely murder.
We've established certain things, and we can't go back on what we've established. There are obvious things that we've studied and photographed. We're sure of ourselves. We're sure of ourselves.
These are people with a lot of experience who have mastered the techniques. And that's a problem too, because it's clear that even at the highest skill level, you can end up with conflicting conclusions.
This uncommon meeting of experts doesn't bring the truth to light with any certainty. Suicide or murder? Both theories have their supporters and their critics.
There are really two versions that are completely at odds, to the point that one of the medical examiners took me aside and said, "Never give up on this case. Your client was murdered."
This battle of experts muddied the waters and drew out the case, without focusing on what was important, searching for the killer.
The inquiry into the cause of Christian Jambert's death gave rise to an unprecedented battle of experts. It all started when the medical examiners from Lyon overruled their Parisian colleagues by concluding the police officer had committed suicide. Can you explain how these two autopsies, which took place 3 weeks apart, ended up reaching totally opposite conclusions?
The second autopsy is much more difficult than the first. The first autopsy inevitably breaks down the body. Traces may have disappeared, particularly if skin or organ samples have been taken. If the first medical examiner had done their job properly, just like after Attila the Hun has passed through, there won't be much left.
Does that mean that the second autopsy is less reliable than the first?
No, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that it's a bit harder to do. But in this case, the first autopsy wasn't carried out in ideal conditions, since remember, it took place 7 years after the death. Forensic medicine may well be the oldest field of expertise in legal investigations, but it isn't an exact science. It provides important information, but it does not in itself get to the truth of the matter.
To sum up, Jean-Marc, in this investigation there have been 2 exhumations, 2 autopsies, a forensic examination of a cast, and finally a meeting between a panel of experts with the victim's bones. It's pretty exceptional.
Yes. Personally, I've never seen an investigation like it. But it all comes back to the same problem. No number of forensic examinations can ever make up for the shortcomings of the preliminary investigations.
Do you think that the meeting between the different experts could still have led to a decision being made about suicide or murder?
The examining magistrate's initiative was commendable, but in my view, it couldn't succeed because one of the experts would have had to admit they were wrong. The problem is these are highly renowned medical examiners who head up prestigious departments in Paris, Lyon, and Bordeaux. They have their reputations to protect, and their credibility comes down to the reliability of their conclusions.
With most of the experts in favor of the suicide theory, the plaintiffs fear that the examining magistrate will dismiss the case. To prevent the case from being closed, Christian Jambert's children's attorney increased their request for action. They're also particularly keen to point out all the inconsistencies and anomalies at the scene where the body was found. Since the start of the case, the plaintiffs have stopped raising evidence in favor of the murder hypothesis. According to Corinne Herman Esquire, it's clear that the investigations into Christian Jambert's death have always been reluctant.
The Jambert case has always ruffled feathers. Since the start, when we asked for inspections, it was already an inconvenience, and we weren't getting answers. In the gendarmerie, it seemed to be a taboo topic.
There are bound to be people from the police force who know something and are scared.
We know we haven't turned over every stone. We know there are things we would still like to clear up, but we've been denied. The more we dig into sensitive areas, the more we're denied, and the more stuck the case becomes.
They wanted to hush up the Jambert case. They didn't want it to be investigated. They did everything they could to rule it as a suicide. It's despicable of the police not to have investigated it.
The plaintiff's attorneys have been able to see the photos taken when the body was discovered.
Jambert's pajamas aren't creased at all. He's in a very peaceful position. His body is in a rather surprising position. It really looks like he's asleep. His arms are in an extremely calm position. The rifle is resting on his right leg, a bit far away, but the way it's placed is rather surprising. It doesn't look like a rifle that's been fired and affected by recoil.
In the photo, Jambert is laying on his back with a weapon on his body, as if he's giving a final military salute. So it makes us wonder if the police put it there. There are doubts about the circumstances around the findings.
The plaintiffs raise another troubling point. The wound on top of Christian Jambert's skull, discovered by the doctor when the body was moved, hasn't been adequately studied.
We never come back to the wound on the top of his skull. And God knows we've asked for explanations. God knows we've been working on it. And God knows we've asked for photos of this wound. Well, we've never stopped asking questions about this wound, and we've never had a response.
For Ms. Herman, this wound could be the result of an assault. The note, written in red ink and signed by Christian Jambert, also raises questions.
No red pen was found near where the note was written.
The message's contents also arouse doubts.
We can't explain the note. There's not one affectionate word, not to his son, not even to his daughter, who he adored. You might expect something along the lines of, "Forgive me, I can't go on, I love you." And then there's something about life insurance we can't make head nor tail of. It's obviously not what Isabelle Jambert or Philippe Jambert expected.
But above all, the plaintiffs put forward witness statements which attest that Christian Jambert felt he was in danger shortly before his death.
Jambert had felt threatened for several months before he died. He told Pierre Manoir about this.
Before his death, Jambert seemed very worried, and he shared his concerns with us. He said someone had sabotaged his car, his brakes, and so on.
He had his car checked. In fact, the mechanic told him there was something odd about his car.
Things had been stolen, things he had bought. There were things concerning his house and car that worried him.
Philippe, Christian Jambert's son, also mentioned these threats during an interview.
At the end, he was feeling threatened. Yes, he told me so clearly. He told me someone had tried to assault him. He showed me the bruises on his face. I asked him questions. He made it very clear that he didn't want to attempt suicide.
Examining Magistrate Frederick Abel was in charge of the investigation into Christian Jambert's death.
Did Christian Jambert feel threatened, or was he actually being threatened? I can't answer that. The fact remains that these investigations, of which there were many, carried out by the police and Jambert's family members and friends, whether police or not, never clearly established the existence of these threats.
Ever since the Plaintiffs' Counsel got access to the case file, they haven't stopped saying that the preliminary findings don't match the suicide hypothesis. Do you share their surprise about the position of Christian Jambert's body?
No, not necessarily. After seeing these photos, they don't strike me as incompatible with someone who's committed suicide. We can imagine that things happened as follows. Christian Jambert was standing, he held the barrel of the rifle in his left hand, his arm was bent, the rifle was parallel to his body, vertical. He pulled the trigger with his right thumb. At the moment of impact, his body stiffened and he fell backwards, and that's why he was found in his initial position.
That is, with his right arm straight by his side and his left arm bent 90 degrees?
Right.
And what do you think about the position of the rifle? It seems to have been placed on the victim's legs. According to the plaintiffs, this could have been staged.
To continue my line of reasoning, when Christian Jambert fell backwards, the weapon naturally slid down his body. It should be noted that a .22 long rifle doesn't have a lot of recoil, so it's not surprising that the weapon and the body stayed close together.
Does this mean that Christian Jambert died by suicide?
I certainly couldn't make such a claim based on a simple photo. I wouldn't dream of it. All I can say is, looking at this photo, I can't exclude the possibility of suicide.
When Philippe Jambert entered his father's house, he found a note on the kitchen table written in red ink, signed Dad, and addressed to his sister Isabelle. This element seems to back up the suicide theory.
Of course, this note immediately suggests that Christian Jambert was planning on taking his own life. But to cast doubt on that, we could imagine that he wrote it under duress, or someone forged his handwriting. It's a shame the pen used to write the note wasn't found. But was it really searched for?
Christian Jambert's children don't believe the suicide note is genuine. They recognized that their father had gone through a serious depression 2 years before his death, but they claimed that since then he had been doing better and he was looking forward to being interviewed for the investigation into the missing women of Yonne. They're convinced that their father was killed. They keep saying that he was receiving threats, which could be traced back to the sensitive cases he had investigated. Officer Christian Jambert never stopped his unofficial detective work. He spent years filling up spiral-bound notebooks. His family and friends knew he kept secret files in a leather briefcase.
He was a seasoned investigator. Without a doubt, he carried on following several cases, not only the missing women of Yonne, but several cases. He continued to take an interest in things he hadn't been able to solve during his career.
After his retirement, Christian Jambert continued to pursue his own personal investigations, often involving cases he had worked on while still a serving officer.
Everyone saw Jambert returning to the police station regularly to check files. He went looking for things in places he shouldn't. He put himself in danger. That could explain what happened to him on August 4th.
Could Christian Jambert have put himself in harm's way? Could his single-handed investigations have led to his murder? The detectives want to answer these questions, so they looked into the big cases Christian Jambert worked on during his career. One case in particular draws their attention: the suicide of Pierre Bérégovoy on May 1st, 1993, in Nevers. Christian Jambert was still a serving officer.
He gets a phone call telling him there's been a tragedy involving the politician Pierre Bérégovoy. The gendarmerie is soon taken off the case, and it's given to the Parisian police. He has a habit of investigating and sticking his nose in, so he then looks into it in a very unofficial but very interesting way.
Soon, Christian Jambert started having doubts about the circumstances of the former Prime Minister's death.
The steps he takes, which we've since come to know about, prove he doesn't believe the suicide theory for a second. One thing he learns for sure is that the people around Bérégovoy aren't all fans of Pierre Bérégovoy and don't feel the affection or sincere friendship towards him that they claim to feel.
But another investigation led by Christian Jambert attracts the police's attention. They wonder if it could have contributed to his death. It's the Claude Dunant case, which began in Auxerre in 1984.
Claude Dunant allegedly kidnapped 2 young women who were in foster care. He raped them, tortured them, and invited people over who paid to rape and torture them.
Officer Jambert was never put on this case, so it was during his free time in an unofficial capacity that he took an interest in the case.
Dunant and his wife were going to stand trial at the courthouse in Yonne. But what was very disturbing in this case was that Dunant had a notebook listing his clients and their details. His notebooks were seen, and they were even seen by Christian Jambert. He saw a notebook with a whole series of addresses, sums of money, and names. Something that could identify the people who unfortunately used and assaulted these women. And in the end, this notebook disappeared.
A rumor spread in Auxerre that public figures were involved in the Dunant case. According to Pierre Monnoir, Christian Jambert would have put himself at risk by investigating these local figures.
Maybe the people who went there weren't worried until they found out that Jambert might have information on them.
By working on these different scandalous cases, Christian Jambert may have made some enemies.
Obviously, at some point, he came to know a certain number of things, both in Yonne and Nièvre, with the Émile Louis case. He came across some things, and he was met with several rejections and obstacles by magistrates and his superiors. All of which means that at some point he was sitting on a lot of information, which could have made someone want to silence him once and for all by killing him.
Since his appearance on the program Perdu de Vue and his many press interviews about the Yonne missing women case, Christian Jambert had become a man with a platform and an investigator who was ruffling feathers.
The fact that he came into the spotlight with the Jan missing women case and was filmed speaking out could have worried someone or other involved in the cases he was working on.
Many believe that the key to solving the mystery of Officer Jambert's death is inside the infamous leather briefcase, which contained all his case files. Disturbingly, this briefcase has never been found.
It's one of the biggest mysteries in this case. If he had committed suicide, how and why would he have gotten rid of or hidden this evidence? Don't forget, when his son, Philippe Jambert, arrived at his father's house, the door was open. I mean to say, it was unlocked.
For Mr. Sabon, it's possible that the killer, while leaving Christian Jambert's house, could have taken the briefcase to make sure the police officer's discoveries were never made public.
It's my biggest regret that I didn't go to his house. I didn't see his documents. I didn't photocopy them or anything.
The disappearance of this leather briefcase is still a mystery. The examining magistrate in charge of the investigation of Christian Jambert's death can't explain it.
Was it stolen? Was it lost? Did Officer Jambert destroy it or throw it out himself? I don't know. What is certain is that it wasn't found, even though several witness statements confirm that it existed.
Philippe Jambert said his father had entrusted him with this briefcase containing different documents and had asked him, a couple of weeks before his death, to give it back. So, he must have had it when he was found dead.
We met with Roger Marc Moreau, a private investigator who Christian Jambert called a short while before his death. His testimony is intriguing.
He said he had a lot of things to tell me, and he could certainly name names. And it was very delicate to talk about over the phone. He knew that. It's possible he told someone that I was going to come and help him break the case wide open. The media was paying attention to me at the time, and there could have been someone listening in. He may have even been under surveillance. The fact remains that he was becoming dangerous to certain people, and they may have wanted to make him disappear.
After this phone call, Roger Marc Moreau and Christian Jambert arranged to meet in Auxerre, but this meeting never took place because the police officer was found dead 3 days before the set date.
When I learned afterwards that the documents he wanted to show me a few days later had disappeared, there was no doubt in my mind that he had been murdered.
Of all the cases Christian Jambert officially investigated, there's one in particular that stands out, the Dunnan case. According to the plaintiff's attorneys and Christian Jambert's family and friends, this case could be connected to the police officer's death. What do you think?
According to this theory, Officer Jambert was allegedly killed because he knew the names of the Dunnan's clients. If you add the rumor that several of their clients were public figures, we have a motive for murder, and a strong one at that. But the problem is, I don't see how Officer Jambert could have had access to Claude Dunnan's notebooks, because neither the Auxerre Gendarmerie Brigade nor any other gendarmerie brigade was involved in this case.
The disappearance of Christian Jambert's briefcase, which several witnesses confirmed existed, could suggest that he had compromising documents in his possession.
When it comes to the disappearance of this briefcase, I can offer no explanation. All I can say is, the search for it started 7 years after Christian Jambert's death. And 7 years is a long time. And it seems to me that there are a lot of fantasies about the contents of this briefcase. If it did contain documents that implicated certain individuals in crimes, I'm convinced Christian Jambert wouldn't have kept them to himself. He would have handed them over to the authorities, like he did with his report on the missing women of Jan.
When Christian Jambert was found dead in his garage in August 1997, he was about to be interviewed as a witness in the Jan missing women case. Do you really think he would have committed suicide just as his work was finally about to be recognized by the justice system?
Suicide isn't a rational act. Christian Jambert was retired. He had devoted a great deal of his life to that investigation. He was fully and personally involved. This case was finally going to be investigated. That could have satisfied him, but he also knew, in a way, that he had to let go of the case, even though it was his reason for existing. But that's psychology, which often lets you say one thing and its opposite, just like this investigation, which went from evidence of suicide to the certainty of murder, with no proof to tip the balance one way or the other.
On January 31st, 2011, the case was dismissed.
Unfortunately, the investigation didn't get to the truth. Evidently, the Auxerre public prosecutor's office wanted to close the Jan missing women case. In a way, they wanted to turn the page. And so there was no longer a willingness to investigate on the part of the magistrates.
Christian Jambert's children have been shattered by the case.
The family had to go through the body being exhumed twice. Battles between experts, and a great deal of media coverage. They had to go through an extremely painful and heavy process.
Since the start of the investigation, the police have remained convinced that Christian Jambert died by suicide. This could explain why his death remains unsolved to this day.
The real scandal is that this case wasn't treated the way Jambert deserved. In other cases, investigators have said to me, a case that starts with certainty always ends with doubt. And I think, because of this certainty of, move on, there's nothing to see, it's a suicide, we're left with a huge question mark. And in my opinion, this huge question mark will remain forever.
It suits a lot of people that the investigation into the cause of his death has finally been dismissed. It probably suits the culprit, the person behind the murder.
Today, only new evidence could lead to reopening the case.
Maybe one day his children will have the truth, because maybe one day someone will have a crisis of conscience and say, I've had enough, I'm going to speak up. It could even be the person or people who killed him, because he knew them. There was no forced entry. He opened the door. He knew them.
When he dismissed the case, the examining magistrate justified his decision with these words. It appears that due diligence was exercised and particularly thorough investigations were conducted into all the hypotheses put forward by the plaintiffs, without any evidence being found to support the theory of homicide. But this dismissal, pronounced after many years of legal proceedings, was not enough to dispel the doubts of those who remained convinced that Christian Jambert was murdered.